So maybe you'll come back again, talk a little bit more about the work you guys are doing. Anthony Zhang, he's co-founder and CEO of VinoVest, joining us on the phone from LA. What's your favorite wine, Paul Sweeney?
I'm liking the Pinot Noirs right now. That's kind of what I'm enjoying.
Nice, nice. Well, listen, I hope you have one over the weekend. Enjoy the holiday weekend. I think you've worked about 25 hours today, so you certainly have earned it.
Take a break.
Exactly. From our whole Bloomberg radio team, have a safe holiday. Actually, you had a holiday, but have a safe weekend. This is Bloomberg.
It's important for each side to understand the sensitivities of the other.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said the incoming Biden administration should move quickly to restore lines of communication with China that frayed during the Trump years, or risk a crisis that could escalate into military conflict.
Unless there is some basis for some cooperative action, the world will slide into a catastrophe comparable to World War I, with a technology that is even more difficult to control than the technology of the period then.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is a difficulty, a challenge, which needs government response.
The Fed is really pleading for fiscal relief. I believe it's essential.
The American administration is about to change, but the clock will not simply be rewound.
How fast could we go to underserved communities and pull people into the middle class for the first time?
There's a period of, I think, great uncertainty and great risk.
Our cities need to be ready for the convergence of the physical and digital worlds.
We need to use our recovery stimulus to invest in the clean and digital technologies of the future.
The question is, what direction are we pointing our economies? We're going to point towards sustainable growth.
It's the most important mindset to break, is that there's a trade-off between a green recovery and an economic prosperity.
Welcome. I'm Carol Masser. We're looking back at the 2020 Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Now in its third year, this annual summit brings together leaders in business, politics, and policy from around the world to discuss the most pressing issues facing the global economy. Now, due to one of those issues, the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020 event was held as a virtual town hall, and it focused on the challenges of rebuilding a new economy in the wake of the virus crisis, one that's inclusive and sustainable for all. To lead us through the program, here's my Bloomberg colleague and forum co-host, Scarlett Fu.
Thanks, Carol. The coronavirus pandemic is the single biggest threat to the health of the global economy, and many believe it's exposed a deep sickness in society, inequality. Central banks have devised policies to keep capital markets liquid and prop up asset prices. But can these institutions use their tools to build a more equal society? Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen and former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King discussed the challenge.
Monetary policy has its limits, and the effective lower bound is a serious constraint. And the notion that the Fed can do all that is required at this point to support the economy is just wrong. And the Fed is really pleading for fiscal relief. I believe it's essential. I think the Fed has been less successful in lending to smaller businesses. That creates an impression of unfairness that the Fed is on the side of big companies and on Wall Street. This is something that's very difficult to accomplish. But, you know, as Chair Powell says, the Fed can't spend, it can't give grants, it can't direct aid to where it's needed to unemployed workers, and fiscal policy has a very important role to play now as well.
Lord King, I know you've echoed some of what Janet Yellen has said in repeatedly saying central banks can't do everything. Do you think they've played the expectations game well in responding to the crisis, or have they set them too high?
So I share much of what Janet has said, but I think to explain what's gone wrong, I don't think central banks have explained clearly why expanding the money supply is the right sort of response to a shutdown of the economy created by governments, different levels of governments, in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This isn't a conventional recession. And as Janet said, the most important thing for central banks to do now is to say that this is a difficulty, a challenge, which needs government response, not central bank response. And I don't think it's government response in the sense of general fiscal easing. I think it's a response that's required to support businesses until we get through this COVID-19 episode, at which point we can then let the market economy decide which businesses will thrive and which will fail, which I don't think we can do at present.
Private companies will also play a critical role in shaping a more equitable economy. IBM Executive Chair Ginny Rometty sized up the task ahead.
This is something we got involved in about a decade ago, and it was for the reason that you could begin to see the digital economy would not be inclusive. There would be far too many have-nots versus haves, and this would revolve around having the right skill to work in a new job and have it quick enough. And so as you see with COVID, and then with all the issues around racism and systemic racism that have evolved, this has just escalated this issue that was, as the minister said, on a slow burn. So what we set out and coined a term new collar, so it would have a positive connotation. We said we had to offer a new pathway for people into our company, not just a traditional four-year degree. And so new collar was meant to be, you could start, it wasn't white collar, it wasn't blue collar, in those connotations with it. It would be about a new collar job so that you could start without a four-year degree. And there are many new jobs that live at this intersection with technology, cloud computing, cyber skills, that you could get started. And what you'd have to believe as an employer is in three different paradigms. And I think in some ways, Jason, this would be my definition of a new social contract. One would be, I would have to hire based on skills first versus degrees only, meaning I'd hire you because you had some skills that you had built in some way. The second paradigm is I'd have to offer a new pathway The minister used that word as well. So in other words, perhaps you've come from a 6-year high school, which is what hopefully we'll talk about. We got very involved around the world in this. And then the third paradigm would be, as an employer, I offer you employability. While I may not guarantee you employment, I can offer you employability, meaning the ability to constantly build the skills that you can have a very good job. Because the issue here is going to become quality jobs, not just any type of job. So that led us down a path of what is a public-private partnership with high schools and community colleges around the world to build and say, how fast could we go to underserved communities and pull people into the middle class for the first time? And we now have a pipeline of almost 200,000 students coming through.
COVID-19 has forced nations to physically isolate. It's also exacerbated geopolitical rivalries. U.S.-China relations are as strained as they've been in decades, even as the two sides signed a Phase 1 trade deal at the start of the year. With a new U.S. president set to take charge in January, prominent voices in business and politics shared their views on the path forward for the superpowers.
The American administration is about to change, but the clock will not simply be rewound.
But unless there is some basis for some cooperative action, the world will slide into a catastrophe.
We shouldn't accept or assume that it's all going to be bad without working to make it better. We got to try to, we got to give the new administration a chance to articulate an approach.
I hope that he will be able to focus his mind on developing a framework for an overall constructive relationship with China, because the last 4 years have been quite a tumultuous ride.
We should build an open world economy that works for all. We must firmly safeguard the multilateral trading system under the WTO and unequivocally reject unilateralism and protectionism.
When your economy becomes, so big and your interests are all over the world, you have to protect your own interests.
I don't think we're going into a world of deep protectionism going forward. I see more regionalism.
I don't think there's a big bang win here for either side.
Coming up, we continue our review of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Ray Dalio says investing will look very different in a post-crisis world.
There are worlds that will be orderly and will prosper in this kind of an environment, and you could see it.
And ECB President Christine Lagarde warns policymakers about financial spillover.
We need to really stay clear of that, because that would be an aggravating factor.
This is Bloomberg.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need is surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
Welcome back to our review of the 2020 Bloomberg New Economy Forum. I'm Carol Masser. The global economy will undoubtedly be different when the world emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic. How it changes will largely depend on how leaders in government, business, and finance work together to rebuild it. Those leaders had plenty to say at the forum. Scarlett Fu has more from our program.
Thanks, Carol. Even before the coronavirus pandemic struck, regime change was underway in the world of investing and finance. Now it's happening even faster. Ray Dalio has been preparing to navigate these choppy waters for a long time. He explained how his firm, Bridgewater, is adapting its portfolio strategy.
There's a period of, I think, great uncertainty and great risk. And so I think there are three words: diversification, liquidity, and then differentiation. We want to make sure that our investors are not just concentrated in some of the traditional markets. So diversification of how to do that well can reduce risk without reducing opportunity. And that means currency diversification, including the reserve currencies, how much exposure is to the reserve currencies, but it means currency diversification, asset class diversification, country diversification, and that should be the starting point of portfolios. In terms of liquidity, it allows you the flexibility to change as circumstances change. And differentiation is the most important consideration now. There are two different worlds. There are worlds that will be orderly and will prosper in this kind of an environment, and you could see it. And that differentiation versus other worlds and markets related to that, that will be bankrupt and disorderly. That kind of differentiation is important.
As president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde will play a critical role in the EU's recovery post-crisis. She discussed the potential for a COVID-19 vaccine by early next year and a key challenge facing policymakers.
I think that the second wave that we saw presents risks. The first risk that I would think of is the fact that consumers, investors, employers do not regard the pandemic as a one-off, this V-shape that we all aspired to, but as something that will recur over the course of time, and as a result would lead them to completely change their behavior. In other words, how about if they start saving again for precautionary purposes? How about if they continue to freeze and hold their investment plans because of the uncertainty generated by this situation? And the second risk that I see is the potential real/financial spillover, which we have managed to avoid so far. So in other words, we have not had the financial sector amplifying the downside that has weighed on the real economy, and we need to really stay clear of that because that would be an aggravating factor.
A portion of the New Economy Forum was devoted to the challenges facing cities. Urban economies have been hit hard during the pandemic, but civic leaders are responding with creativity and tenacity, reinventing the modern metropolis. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi shared his views on the future of cities.
We are looking at a future where a major chunk of education, healthcare, shopping, food experiences may happen online. Our city need to be ready for the convergence of the physical and digital worlds.
Of course, cities have had to confront public health threats for centuries. Here's a look at how lessons learned from previous pandemics may help with the global recovery from COVID-19.
Humanity has faced the challenge of deadly disease for thousands of years. And whenever a new pandemic takes hold, civilizations adapt in response. In the 19th century, cholera epidemics in Europe set off an outcry for investment in modern sanitation and urban renewal. The movement sparked Baron Haussmann's transformation of Paris into the city of light, trading crowded slums for wide tree-lined boulevards and monuments lit by gas lamps. Haussmann's modernization prompted cities all over the world to follow suit. London added sewage systems, and New York built Central Park, adding a reservoir and green space for city dwellers to take in fresh air. At the turn of the 20th century, tuberculosis swept through the US, creating a greater need for urban parks and bringing light and air into building designs. The 1918 flu pandemic led to the invention of the radiator, with steam heating systems designed to allow windows to be left open, even during winter months, for improved ventilation. COVID-19 has already intensified a push by cities around the world to reduce pollution by adding bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, and implementing building design changes. Paris is pioneering the idea of a 15-minute city, creating walkable communities of shops, schools, and clinics, reducing the necessity of cars or public transport. In the distant past, it took decades for pandemics to leave their mark on our city's urban design and architectural landscape. Well, the changes sparked by this COVID-19 are already taking shape.
Coming up, more from the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. BlackRock's Larry Fink sees momentum building to combat the climate crisis.
We were beginning to see the tsunami of change already from the private sector.
And with vaccines on the horizon, Bill Gates discusses how COVID can be conquered. This is Bloomberg.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
I am David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
Welcome back to our review of the 2020 Bloomberg New Economy Forum. I'm Carol Masser. Climate change poses risks to the global economy that could ultimately cause deeper and more permanent damage than COVID-19. For more on the discussion of climate change and the green economy at the forum, here's Scarlett Fu.
Thanks, Carol. Leaders in business, finance, and government at the New Economy Forum made the case for a green recovery to repair the economic damage from the pandemic, and they expressed optimism that it can be done.
This is about capitalizing on existing market forces, not fighting them. We need to use our recovery stimulus to invest in the clean and digital technologies of the future, to make our economies more resilient and our societies and job markets fairer.
This is an opportunity to both address the problems that will come out of this crisis, to restart growth, to put the global economy
not just on a higher growth trajectory, but also on a much more sustainable growth trajectory. So going forward, and we do hear countries announcing plans to step up action on the climate front. And so I am hopeful that much more will be done. But 2021 is the year when this should happen.
It is Unilever's profound belief that purpose and sustainability are a pathway to better financial performance. There is no trade-off. And we're already seeing that money that gets invested in green stimulus seems to generate a better ROI than the more broad stimulus packages. So it's the most important mindset to break, is that there's a trade-off between a green recovery and an economic prosperity.
In 2020, we saw at BlackRock more than a doubling of investments towards climate change. And the inquiry we're having from U.S. companies, U.S. foundations, globally, we're seeing a change. So we were beginning to see the tsunami of change already from the private sector. And now with the potential of having a Biden administration, I think we're going to need the government to come along and help us on this journey.
Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney has shifted his focus from monetary policy to climate policy. He's working with the UK government and the United Nations on climate action and finance. Carney told Bloomberg's Alex Steele there's no time to waste in this effort.
We need to invest now. I mean, we're touch wood, we're going to be coming out of the health and economic crisis. The question is, what direction are we pointing our economies? We're going to point towards sustainable growth. Huge investment. You rightly started with that, Alex. Huge numbers for investment that's capital intensive. It's job heavy. Having that information now so companies and investors can put money to work is critical.
So what role then does policy play in that? We just had an election, obviously, here in the U.S. What's the role of public policy?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple roles. One, and I wouldn't understate this first bit, is set the direction. So one of the planks of President-elect Biden's platform was the U.S. is going to move to 100% clean energy and net zero by 2050. So you set the direction. Secondly, you put in place the frameworks that are necessary, that information for investors to make the decision, and you also have credible regulatory policy. So you're showing the direction of the economy. More hydrogen, zero emission vehicles, moving towards electrifying more of the economy and moving the electricity sector and generation towards renewables. All of those things send signals to investors, provide the information as well, and gets money moving. So that's what government has to start with: the objective, fill in with the framing, and then candidly get out of the way so the private sector figures out where to go.
Investors around the world are demanding green investments. But what exactly does green mean? Guggenheim's Scott Minerd addressed this issue from an investor's perspective.
Very little time is being spent on trying to set economic incentives. Until the private sector has economic incentives to get there, the reality is that everybody will continue to act in what they think is their best interest. And right now, a great organization like HSBC, who's made a huge commitment and is way ahead of the curve, can be negatively impacted if they move too aggressively when other people decide they're going to take advantage of the fact that HSBC has changed their policies.
So do you think that this is something that needs harmonization, like in a way that we bring more groups together to sort of set targets? Is this a policymaker's question? Like, who's going to be the prime mover on making this come together in a way that's beneficial for everyone?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think the policymakers need to look at this and understand that there are incentives that can be put in place which basically don't cost anything for the governments. But two, I think the investment community in the broad sense should be getting together and discussing this issue to try to be develop a uniform standard about a baseline for what the objectives are, what the definitions are, and what the rules of the road are.
The Bloomberg New Economy Forum also featured sessions on infectious disease research, public health, and the progress of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A conversation with Bill Gates touched on several of these critical issues, including the prospects for eliminating, not just controlling, the coronavirus.
We don't know enough yet to say, can we do the elimination of this? That would be the best, because then zero's magical, because it just doesn't spread at all. It doesn't come back. I think there's a good chance we can do that, but we'll have to look at the vaccines, how good they are at blocking transmission. Because this is a super spreader disease, it is likely we can do that. Otherwise, we'll have to maintain immunity on an indefinite basis, which probably means booster shots. And a little bit, as people come into the country, do they have a digital certificate that says whether they've been vaccinated or not, which that's fairly complex and will need for a period of time, like we tried to do with yellow fever. But as the U.S. rejoins the WHO, this idea of what does the vaccine certificate look like, hopefully that dialogue will begin.
Visit Bloomberg.com to see much more from the 2020 New Economy Forum. Bloomberg subscribers can access NEF Go on the terminal for complete coverage. I'm Scarlett Fu. Carol, back to you.
Thanks, Scarlett. And thanks to all the participants who made the Bloomberg New Economy Forum a success. As the world continues to battle the pandemic, we hope it will help inspire the practical solutions and innovative actions needed for an inclusive, sustainable economic recovery. I'm Carol Masser. Stay safe, everyone. This is Bloomberg.
A sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
Chinese capital market, as you know, is nascent, is just developing, and so we think there's an opportunity to build out that. But that's not all. We're also focused on continuing to build our presence in the Greater Bay Area. It's been a good business for us.
Is the go-to site for raves, rants, and recommendations. Since its launch in 2004, chances are, if it's a business down the street from you, it's got a Yelp page. But the coronavirus pandemic dealt a devastating blow as thousands of businesses across the country were forced to shut down. Yelp laid off 1,000 of its own employees. Now, with a vaccine in sight, but virus uncertainty still ahead, Yelp serves as a sort of mirror to the health of American business. Still, it's not COVID that CEO Jeremy Stoppelman is most worried about. It's the growing shadow of Google. In this edition of Bloomberg Studio 1.0, Yelp co-founder and CEO Jeremy Stoppelman.
Take me back to March 2020. The pandemic hits and the lights go out, literally, at thousands of small businesses across the United States. As the person who runs the most prominent platform for small businesses in the country, what was that moment like for you?
Probably the best word is terror. It was a scary moment, I think, obviously for America, for small businesses, and especially for Yelp, because we're a way to find great local businesses. And, the first thing crossing my mind is, are people going to still buy advertising? Like, are all businesses going to be affected or just a portion? We had gone through, I was CEO in 2008 when we had that major recession. And so I knew that Yelp as a company should be resilient, but I had never faced anything remotely like a pandemic where every business is potentially affected by shutdowns. So it was a very scary moment for me and for the company.
Did reviews come to a standstill? Did advertising stop?
We certainly took a pretty big hit in advertising dollars as people paused their campaigns. Fortunately, we had functionality that allowed them to set a future date. And so we encouraged people to, set a resume date for their advertising months later, perhaps as the pandemic had passed, or at least when the panic would have subsided. Our focus at Yelp was really getting employees ready to work from home, getting people out of offices. This is all, kind of late February. It hit our radar as, hey, this is coming. We need to get, salespeople at home. All of our salespeople have desktop computers in an office. Like, how do we get them equipped to try and work out of their home and keep the company running? And so there was a lot of operational challenges transitioning people to work from home and getting ready to try and adapt to this extreme crisis.
So fast forward to fall, Yelp shares spike 20% on news of the early success of the Pfizer vaccine. And if everything works out, that could mean the economy opens faster. That's good for small businesses. That's good for Yelp. How optimistic are you?
None of us have been through a pandemic before, so we can't know everything. But, I can't say that in the last quarter, things really had come back. Economic activity had picked up. We were seeing people starting to dine at restaurants. Obviously, with the better weather, we weren't quite into winter yet. People were returning to restaurants. Home and local services, as people spent more time at home, really has held up throughout the pandemic. We've really come back in a big way, faster than even we were hoping for. And with the vaccine potentially arriving and starting to get out there, I think we can finally say, hey, there is light at the end of this tunnel. That's been the scariest thing about the whole crisis is we had hoped that a vaccine would arrive, but actually knowing that one is there and that it's actually 90% effective, I think is very exciting. Certainly for us at Yelp, hopefully for lots of in the minds of small business owners, and the rest of the world is very happy, I think, to hear that news.
So what are you expecting to see over the holidays, given that we're going into winter, cold and flu season, a potential spike in COVID cases? We're already seeing hospitalization surge, and we know that people aren't going to be traveling and out there shopping and eating out like they normally would.
I mean, it's hard. I'm not currently contemplating national shutdowns where everyone is frozen in place like they were, kind of the March, April timeframe. I think people will have to be cautious, in restaurant dining will probably be curtailed or very limited depending on the situation in that particular region. But I think again for Yelp's business, a lot of it is buoyed by the home and local sector, which has done really well. As people are home, things happen. Your roof leaks, you got to get that fixed. Your toilet clogs, well, your whole family is, your kids are possibly doing their remote schooling there. You got to get that thing fixed. And so those service providers will continue to do well and will continue to spend to acquire leads from sites like Yelp.
Now, you regularly release these economic impact reports, and from what I can tell, by the end of summer, you found that 160,000 businesses had closed on Yelp. Where does that number stand now? What are businesses telling you about how they're doing region to region?
We have seen, lots of businesses reopen that were temporarily closed. I think the number is around 220,000 of the temporarily closed businesses have opened back up again, which is a great sign. And also from a new business standpoint, especially in the restaurant and food sector, we're seeing new business openings at levels that are in line with 2019. So, that's one really inspiring thing showing kind of the resilience of American entrepreneurship is that businesses are, new entrepreneurs are still being born in this environment, which is incredible. I think it just shows incredible tenacity and bodes well for the economy as we start thinking about 2021 and beyond.
Now, early on in in the pandemic, Yelp laid off 1,000 people. You furloughed a bit more than that. Where does staffing stand now?
At the start of the pandemic, obviously, we saw advertising revenue dropping very rapidly. We had to make some very tough calls around our people, people that were incredible employees for us, and it was a very difficult moment. We had to lay off 1,000 people, as you mentioned. We also furloughed about 1,000 people as well. And that set us into that put us into a stable position to ride out sort of the immediate impact of the pandemic and whatever economic damage would result. And 4 months later, we were actually in a position to be able to bring back extend offers back to almost all of the furloughed employees. And so that was a great feeling. Obviously, it's very tough, to let anybody go. But we had made a commitment to these furloughed employees, and so it was great to see so many of them back working at Yelp, and many of which are here today.
Now, the pandemic, as you alluded to, has become very, very political, and I'm wondering what your take is on Joe Biden's election. Are you at all concerned that his safety-first approach could, mean the economy opens more slowly?
I think we have to be guided by science. We have to take a dispassionate look. We have to take politics out of it and say, we can't really have a great economy if everyone's cowering, from impacts of the pandemic, or hospitals are getting overloaded with cases. So we just have to take a sensible approach. We have to listen to the scientists. If they're telling us that, wearing masks is going to, diminish the impact of the pandemic, then we should all be wearing masks. It's very straightforward. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's very frustrating that it has been. And I think that costs us valuable time, and even more importantly, costs us health and even lives.
It seems like the next stimulus package might be more scaled back. Are you concerned about a divided government, meaning that small businesses aren't going to get the help they need?
I think the Fed chair has been pretty clear that, businesses need support, especially small businesses need support. And I think the initial stimulus package was a positive. And, we've been all waiting and hoping for another one. And I think, we shouldn't just have socialism for big companies where they can borrow endlessly with cheap debt from the, powered by the Fed. We should extend the helping hand to all these great small business owners that are just trying to get by. An assistant of mine, broke into a meeting and tapped me on the shoulder and literally slipped me a Post-it note that said, "Steve Jobs is on the line."
We could spend a lot of time talking about old stories. You've been in Silicon Valley a long time. You were part of the early PayPal team. But there's one old story that I really do want to ask you about, which is that Google tried to buy Yelp back in 2009 for over $500 million, and you turned them down. Explain how that played out.
Well, I think that Yelp was doing something really positive, which was, growing quickly, gathering all this useful information about local businesses that, frankly, no other site had. And I think Google saw that Maps was of growing importance to them and was interested in Yelp. And we initially had a partnership. But ultimately, I think, Google wasn't satisfied with that partnership and wanted to get into the business themselves. And so then, there was a back and forth where they had some interest in Yelp. But ultimately, it didn't work out. I think we saw things differently. And I think that was good. It allowed Yelp to stay independent and to grow on its own. And frankly, I think I've been able to develop as a CEO quite a bit as well. So I think it's been good for me personally.
Now, as the story goes, Steve Jobs, who was obviously running Apple at the time, Google's biggest competitor, called you to convince you to turn it down. Did that really happen?
It did. Yeah, it was a bit of a surreal moment. I'd call it probably a career highlight, still a peak highlight for me. When an assistant of mine, broke into a meeting and tapped me on the shoulder and literally slipped me a Post-it note that said Steve Jobs is on the line. And so I ran out of the meeting and then, picked up the phone. And of course, it wasn't Steve Jobs. It was Steve Jobs' assistant was on the line. And so then I was waiting for Steve Jobs, who did ultimately get on the phone. And he had some not so nice things to say about Google and some nice things to say about Yelp, and said, he loved Yelp and that we should keep going. And if it was a money thing, then we should be talking to Apple, not Google, but we should just keep doing what we're doing. And, I thought that was good advice.
So fast forward to today, Yelp is now a $2 billion public company, but also Google is now your biggest competitor. Did you make the right call?
Well, I think I did. I think Yelp continues to serve on its mission, which is connecting people with great local businesses. And it's been a really rewarding journey. And I think lots of people find Yelp still incredibly valuable. I think, over 100 million people come to Yelp every single month and steer themselves to a great local business. So I think it's going well.
So the Department of Justice has recently sued Google over antitrust. Taking on Google, competing against Google is no joke for any business. What was your reaction to the suit?
We've been working on this topic for a very long time, so there was a good feeling, I would say, in the Yelp office, because we've been kind of shouting from the rooftops for a very long time that there is a monopoly problem in this country, and in particular, there is a Google problem in this country, and Google has behaved illegally. And has leveraged its monopoly in ways that are destructive to innovation and competition, and bad. It's bad for consumers. Bad for small business owners. And so it was great to see some early validation of that from the DOJ.
Now, we've all seen the increasing number of Google reviews, and Yelp's main complaint that Google favors its own reviews over yours isn't actually the core of the case. Are you at all concerned that your concerns might get passed over?
I mean, it's hard to say where the case goes right now because the state AGs will be, sort of bringing their own cases, and presumably it gets consolidated. So it's hard to know the exact scope of the case. I think, the early signs that, from our perspective are positive. And, again, there's bipartisan support for really scrutinizing Google and taking a look at their behavior over the last decade. You look at television over the last 40, 50 years, it was a highly regulated industry. You look at radio, highly regulated. Even going back to movies, there were antitrust cases that made a big difference in the distribution of films. And so why is it that technology should be completely immune to that, especially these new, sort of the Google generation of technology companies? Why shouldn't, Congress exercise its power? Why shouldn't the DOJ investigate? Why shouldn't the FTC investigate?
You told 60 Minutes back in 2018, if I were starting out today, I would have no shot of building Yelp. That opportunity has been closed off by Google and their approach. If you provide great content in one of these categories that's lucrative to Google and seen as potentially threatening, they will snuff you out. They will make you disappear. They will bury you. Has Google continued to try to bury Yelp since that time?
I mean, it's an easy thing to test for yourself. You could just, do essentially any search with local intent and then see how far down the page you have to go to get to any kind of organic result, especially in, a category that's particularly lucrative from a SMB advertising standpoint. I mean, they've really tried to maximize the revenue, and in doing so have put the consumer in the back seat. And I think that's a real problem. But then also it stifles innovation, because if it's basically there's no organic content anymore, there isn't really that incentive for creators to try and create new and interesting websites, collect information from users. I think it's quite sad. And I think if you talk to the venture capital community, you'll hear that as well. There just isn't as much interest in ideas that are powered by search engine optimization, where you create really wonderful content and then Google or other search engines drive you traffic. Like, it's just Google now, and if it's a lucrative vertical, they're going to try and suck up all the revenue.
Now, President-elect Biden hasn't detailed his thoughts on antitrust yet, but we know that the Obama administration was fairly close to Silicon Valley, and Google in particular. How would you like Biden to weigh in on antitrust? What do you want lawmakers to do? Should Google be broken up?
Yeah, I think all we can ask for is independent thought. And so you're absolutely right that unfortunately the Obama administration has a very bad record when it comes to antitrust enforcement, and especially Google scrutiny. I think Google's lobbyist was the #1 lobbyist in the White House by visits. And so that's been widely reported. And even as the FTC was purportedly investigating, there was seemingly back-channel communication with Google, which is very sad to learn of. And so I would hope, and I think there's some indication that Biden is going to take a more independent view of this. And I think we'll have to see, who's involved in the administration, who's in the cabinet, who are the people around Biden. My personal thought is somehow we have to get Elizabeth Warren in there, because she's been particularly strong on, hammering home the point that monopolies are not good for the economy. They're not good for innovation. They're not good for consumers. And so we need someone like that with a really strong message and a strong independence streak as well.
Now, all of that said, some businesses have complained that Yelp reviews skew more negative. How do you respond to, this complaint from businesses who, might prefer Google because they see that they have more positive reviews there?
We try to be, the most independent, create a level playing field for businesses. And, that frustrates businesses that, frankly, on other platforms are used to getting what they want, which is, being able to ask their friends to write reviews for them, being 5 stars. And in fact, the data supports that. So the FTC, an economist there, recently put out a paper that talked about the review distribution on the various platforms. And Yelp actually has the most balanced review system, which is very validating. That feels great to me, because that's what we're trying to achieve, is just a mirror of the real world.
If you are a woman or a person of color in Silicon Valley these days, what's your advice?
These are talented people. They do have a lot of options, so make sure you choose an option that supports you and makes you feel valued.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
You're an engineer, you worked at X.com, back in the day, the online bank that was started by Elon Musk, which merged with PayPal. What are some of the biggest lessons you've taken from that time in your life and those people who I imagine are still in your life today?
One of the big takeaways from PayPal was just how much you could do even if you had no experience. And so I joined X.com, which eventually merged with PayPal when I was 22, I think. And very quickly, I became an engineering manager, maybe a year and a half later, 2 years later, and then ultimately rose into the executive ranks there on the engineering side. And thinking about it, it was kind of preposterous that those folks would give me so much responsibility so early in my career. But the fact that we somehow pulled it off and created a successful consumer brand and payment site that ended up being really critical to eBay, and then ultimately now as a payment service that so many of us use, I think validates that it's not all about experience. A lot of it is great determination, creativity, innovation, all of those good things. And so I've tried to bring that with me to Yelp, frankly. And we try to make sure that people have fantastic careers. We have a lot of growth from within when it comes to promotions. And we have a lot of homegrown, now senior employees. And so it's really validating to see people step up and take on more responsibility over time.
Where do you fall on the importance of culture? Because it seems like there's a group of CEOs in Silicon Valley who seem to think it's important and others who seem to think it's all about growth.
Well, I think you want both. I think it's hard to be a company and not have robust growth. It just fundamentally is difficult, especially in the technology industry where things change so fast. So if you're not growing, then you're probably not keeping up, and then eventually you fall over. But I think we also see that culture is important, especially in recruiting the top talent that you need to succeed here in Silicon Valley. Is you need to have a great culture. You need to be on top of things, what's going on in your organization. Because if you don't, somebody else will be good at that, and then people will flock to that company that is also high growth. There's always other shiny new objects out there, and so you want to deliver, I think, on both dimensions as a CEO.
There's been some reporting in Business Insider that Yelp has an aggressive sales culture. What's been your response to that?
I mean, we're one of the most highly scrutinized sales teams, I think, in the history of local sales teams. I mean, for many, many years, business owners, for instance, would accuse us of extortion because they claimed that you could take down Yelp reviews if you paid us. That was never true. And so any individual anecdotal accusation, I think you have to take with a grain of salt. We do have thousands of salespeople, and so is every conversation going to be perfect? Absolutely not. But, we have systems in place to ensure that the conversations are the ones that we expect, are empathetic, are thoughtful, and the vast, vast majority of those conversations are great.
Now, I've interviewed many folks in the PayPal mafia over the years, and they all seem to agree that, very smart, but also very lucky to have each other. If you are a woman or a person of color in Silicon Valley these days, what's your advice? How do you break through if you don't have that kind of a network?
I mean, I think Silicon Valley has gotten better on this dimension. I think there's a growing awareness of the need to create opportunities for people of color, for women. And so I would make sure that you're aligned with a company that does care about these things. I think Yelp is a company that does care about these things, that cares a great deal about diversity. And a lot of these companies are now publishing, annually their numbers on how are things improving. Are they making progress? Do they have something to show? And I think Yelp has consistently made progress on that dimension, and it's all public. It's published annually in our reports. And so that's probably my best advice is these are talented people. They do have a lot of options, so make sure you choose an option that supports you and makes you feel valued. Because there's so many great companies in Silicon Valley. Like, don't waste your time on someone that doesn't value you.
When you look ahead, let's say 5 years from now, and the pandemic is hopefully in the rearview mirror, what is going to be the biggest source of growth?
Well, I think we have a lot of opportunity to better monetize Yelp. We talked about how only about 20% of our leads are monetized right now, and so we'd love to see that percentage drift up because there's just so much incredible value flowing through Yelp, accruing to business owners, and we want to give a boost to the people that are paying us. We want to help our advertisers get more leads, and so that's a big focus for the company. And also, we just want to build out our presence in home and local in some of these areas that people may not be as aware of. Like, I think across the country, everyone knows Yelp as a restaurant site, but how do we shift that perception and really, drive home the message that Yelp is for anything that you need locally, any service provider, any local business, you should be turning to Yelp because it has, as we talked about, the most balanced rating system, the most useful and trustworthy information. And so skip that whole Google box and just come to the Yelp app.
That's a great place to end it. Jeremy Stoppelman, thank you so much for joining us today on Studio 1.0. It's been great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Some things you see coming. Some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. Pablo from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
What is at the moment what we see as scaled up worldwide, globally, beyond CureVac even, there will be enough capacity to really vaccinate the world, well, let's say until the end of next year.
This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
While I watch your interviews, I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said, fine. I didn't negotiate with him. I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? Many of the world's largest pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturers are racing to find a cure for COVID-19. One of those companies is GlaxoSmithKline, based in England and also now the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. Its CEO is Emma Walmsley. She was trained in classics at Oxford, but now has an incredible task, producing a vaccine that will help cure COVID-19. So how many times a day do people ask you when your vaccine is going to be available?
Yes, well, that's definitely a very regular question, whether it's from employees, customers, governments, media, or my mother. So very frequently. And obviously, we've all been delighted to see the very recent news of some of the first results that's coming through on vaccines. Yesterday, I was just on a call last night with 10 of the global pharma CEOs who are all very heavily involved in bringing solutions to COVID. And we're really excited and optimistic to see some of the first data coming through and looking forward to seeing a lot more in the next 6 months or so. We have 3 vaccines in the clinic and 2 therapeutic treatments. Everyone is understandably very impatient because I think the IMF said it's every month we wipe off the pandemic is 500 billion of value for the world. But I think right now we can be increasingly optimistic that science will win and our industry that's mobilized so fast will start to bring some scale solutions. And we're going to need more than one, that's for sure.
Now, normally to have a vaccine, it takes 4 to 7 years. The polio vaccine was 7 years. I think mumps and Ebola was 4 years. So this is being done in basically a year or so. So is it because you have so many people working on it that you're able to do it so quickly? Or is it less complicated than people originally thought?
Well, it certainly remains a very complicated effort, but when you're facing into a global crisis of this scale and this impact, there are many reasons that we have been able, as an industry, to mobilize behind getting to some faster solutions. But the ways you get to go faster are an incredible mobilization and partnership with regulators and governments. The fact that we have all been parallel pathing work that you might normally do sequentially, and that has been through putting capital at risk. But we've always, and that's why many of us signed a commitment around the quality of the work, the scale of the trials, and the commitment to safety. And wherever the pressure might have understandably come from to go faster, we're all very committed to make sure that trust in vaccination is maintained, because the world will pay a very big price, not just for COVID, but beyond that, if we break trust in the quality of vaccination. And it has, frankly, been the biggest contribution to human health since clean water, and we need to make sure that that's maintained for the future.
So some people are not willing to take a vaccination. Some people have said in surveys in the United States, only 25% or less of people say they want to take this vaccine because they think it's either been politicized and not sure it's safe, or some people just don't like vaccines anyway. Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
Well, yes, of course. I do think, and we remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy, but we also have to be incredibly respectful about why people have these questions. You know, have we been able to move fast? Have the companies put in the right kind of processes and scales of trials? What transparency are we going to bring to these processes? And why do you hear about things being stopped and started again? What does all of this mean? So I think our job is to make the commitments we have, and we have very publicly about that alongside other manufacturers, but also make sure we share data transparently and partner with governments who ultimately are those that guide in different countries around policies and distributions to reassure people. And again, because, you know, we don't worry about our children dying of measles anymore. There are smallpox has been eradicated, polio nearly so, and this is because of this incredible contribution to protecting people, and protecting life is always better than intervening at a later stage.
Now, you have teamed up for the coronavirus vaccine with Sanofi, which is another large pharmaceutical company. I'm just curious, why did you team up with someone else? You're the biggest manufacturer of vaccines. Could you not have done this yourself?
Well, I think it's one of the great things that we've all seen in many industries through this pandemic is this incredible collaboration against a common competitor or enemy. And when we announced our approaches to vaccines development in the beginning of February, we said our best chance of contributing GSK science, technology, and know-how was to offer our adjuvant technology, it's called, which helps make other vaccines more effective, and an adjuvant technology that has been proven in pandemics to any credible partners. So we have 3 vaccines partnered in the clinic with others, including Sanofi, because that adjuvant technology is proven in pandemic to work on older people and is a more effective way to get to scale manufacturing, which is the other real challenge here. We need to probably provide up to 14 billion doses if we're in 2-dose vaccines to really protect the world. And so, as well as getting to a safe and effective vaccine, we need to get to scale as fast as possible. And our route to that was partnership.
Okay, there are 2 questions that people often ask as well about whether vaccines are not only going to be available, but to whom are they going to be available first? Let's suppose you come up with one. Who gets them first? Private equity professionals, do they get them first or not first in line? And secondly, what's it going to cost?
Well, firstly, these are 2 fundamental questions. And again, right from the beginning, we said at GSK that our principles were around global access, which is why scale of manufacturing, getting to billions of doses and having multiple vaccine solutions, not just the first one off the block, matters. Some of the new technologies that are being distributed have to be distributed at minus 70 degrees, I think, which is not suitable for going back to profit from any COVID vaccine during the pandemic phase. We would reinvest any short-term profits in pandemic preparedness, donations to the developing world. In terms of who gets it, we are contracted to governments in the US, Europe, the UK, Canada, and others, but we also just about supplying to the developing world where you have many vulnerable populations. The first principle should be the people who get it first are the people who need it most.
Now, you are the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world, as I understand it. Some people say that vaccines are not the most profitable part of the pharmaceutical industry because, as I understand it, with a regular drug that one might manufacture, people might take it once a week, once a month, or so forth. With vaccines, you take it once or twice and you're done. So some people say that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't really care about vaccines as much as maybe they should. Is that fair? And is it that profitable a business to be in the vaccine business?
Well, first of all, I think everyone in the world, every family, community, company, and country cares a lot more about vaccines and is looking at it a lot more now than perhaps we did 2 years ago or a year ago. We are the largest manufacturer. We have more than 30 vaccines. We ship 2 million vaccines a day. I think we vaccinate about 40% of the world's children, and it is a profitable business. But it's a business that comes with responsibility around access too.
So why do you think it is that pharmaceutical companies, and you're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, generally the public says maybe they are making too much money and maybe your image is not as good as you would like it to be? Why do you think that's happened, and do you think there's anything the industry can do to improve its image with the public?
I think this is a really fundamental question for our industry because, I mean, you just need to look this year at how mobilized we've been, what a difference we can make, and how much for healthcare resilience globally our contribution is required. And I'm really proud of my company, but our industry for the way we've tried to collaborate for that. But the fact remains that we're still turning up in movies as the industry that people have criticisms of. And fundamentally, you can understand why there is this, when people, not just in developing countries, but in the most powerful countries in the world, are still fighting for access to healthcare for themselves or the people they love. And there is this tension, as you say, between the human right to access to healthcare and profits in big corporates, a perceived tension. And frankly, I think the industry hasn't always historically helped itself, either because of a small number of egregious acts on pricing or not enough transparency about why we do what we, how we do what we do and why it matters. And I think that what we can do about that is to do a better job of fulfilling our purpose to protect health, find new solutions to fight new diseases responsibly. So partnering with governments to help address out-of-pocket challenges, to bring more transparency and stability to how people can engage with healthcare, to champion access across the world, to be responsible always in our pricing, to bring transparency to the way we work, but also do a better job of showing why it matters to everybody that we do that profitably. Because 1 in 2 of us gets cancer. 1 in 3 of us, maybe it's 1 in 2 too. It doesn't matter how successful all the people are that you interview. We don't have treatments for dementia and Alzheimer's, and we need to keep fighting and investing to be able to solve these problems for the future.
So is it cheaper and easier for a company like GSK to go buy somebody that has already made a product and put it into your system rather than try to develop it yourself? Because I realize that it takes 10 years or more to develop a product. So is it easier sometimes and better to go buy something? And how do you see the trade-offs between the two?
What we're all working hard to do is get to a better quality pipeline. And it would be incredibly arrogant to think, you know, all the world's best scientists sit inside your company, which is why business development and M&A is so common in our industry. The other thing to remember is that because of the patent cliff model in pharma, you are having to and it's another reason why, as well as delivering on our purpose responsibly, we have to do it profitably. You are having to reinvent your portfolio, you know, on a rolling decade basis, because we invest in the innovation, we build that drug, and then rightly it comes off patent, can be genericized, and the sales are lost, you know, very aggressively and quickly.
Now, you're a member of the Microsoft board, so I assume you have a fair degree of background now in technology and IT and other things like that. How have you been able to apply that to what you're doing at GSK?
Well, I would never describe myself as having a background in technology and IT, and I'm absolutely sure that was not why I was brought onto the Microsoft board. But it's an extraordinary company doing extraordinary things in an incredibly responsible way at a time when technology is changing the world, and industries, and I believe can be an incredible force for good. You know, it'll be interesting to see what we look back on the 2020s as standing for and meaning and what evolved. No doubt 2020, loads of people will be writing books about how to lead through a COVID crisis. But I think most of us believe that there will be other, you know, huge global issues that we'll have to address, like climate change and inclusive economic recovery, etc. But I also believe health resilience will be on the agenda. And the advances that the world has seen in biology, all of the genetics and genomics data that's coming through, at the same time as the advances the world has seen in AI and machine learning, combined together, have a real shot over the next decade to improve the productivity of R&D and science in my industry incredibly. You know, it is really hard to discover new drugs and vaccines. 90% of them fail. It takes a long time. Obviously, the world is mobilized right now to get to faster solutions. And I hope we learn lessons in our way we partner with regulators and use new technologies to permanently accelerate some of these processes. But the opportunity to use technology to identify and the enormous amounts of data to identify better quality targets, so we have a biological target, so we have a higher probability of success of developing better medicines faster for these enormous unmet needs in the world, I think will be defining for the next decade.
When you were in Oxford, did you say you wanted to do what you're now doing, or what was your career ambition?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that I spent most of my time in my master's looking at Latin poetry, which was not an obvious path towards this destiny so far.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
When you grew up, you went to Oxford and you majored in modern languages and classics. And as a general rule of thumb, most people running pharmaceutical companies are not majors in classics or Romance languages. So when you were in Oxford, did you say you wanted to do what you're now doing, or what was your career ambition?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that I spent most of my time in my master's looking at Latin poetry, which was not an obvious path towards this destiny so far. And honestly, I am probably the person you've interviewed who had the least strategic career plan ever. My entire work experience, up until I left all studies, was waitressing. I never had, any kind of internship or anything like that. I went into consultancy for a few years because I needed to pay off my debts. And then, because I spoke French, I was in charge of benchmarking L'Oreal. And I just got super curious about that industry, and then took a pay cut to go and be the assistant product manager on a home hair color. And then spent 17 years going all around the world, just tremendous opportunities living and working in Paris, in New York for 5 years, then in China, and never thought I'd leave. And then had one of those kind of accidental meetings at the time in Shanghai with the then CEO of GSK, who explained and convinced me that I should move into the consumer business at GSK. I couldn't resist the chance to pursue, I thought, of a business with an incredibly important and impactful purpose, which is health, and also have the chance to run a global division. I had no idea that that would then lead to this, but it's been exciting so far.
So what did your family say when you said, I'm going to be in the pharmaceutical or healthcare business?
Well, my family, because I had 4 children and we were living in Shanghai in China, and I said, guess what, I've got a new idea. We're not completely thrilled at the prospects at the time, but they, and then, you know, obviously, I mean, I grew up, my father was in the Navy his whole career. I grew up in a military family where there was a tremendous sense of work ethic and duty and responsibility, and I think you know, they were incredibly proud when we eventually came back to the UK after being out for 10 years, and excited to see the work that we've been doing since.
So you're a consumer healthcare specialist in addition to being a classics person and a modern language person. But then you, in effect, sold off, or you've joint ventured your consumer healthcare business. Did you ever expect when you came to GSK that you would actually not be doing consumer healthcare and you'd be doing the traditional pharmaceutical healthcare?
Well, the short answer to that is no. But I'm incredibly excited to see, frankly, the creation of 2 world-leading businesses. And in consumer health, we built the joint venture with Pfizer and declared at the time of doing that deal that we would, by around mid-22, separate that company out to be an independent company, because it's the only standalone, dedicated to consumer healthcare, consumer products company in the world. It's got leading positions in leading markets, in leading categories, and frankly, having it inside, as a slightly invisible division, a much bigger company whose #1 priority is to invest in the biopharma pipeline, in innovation, around the science of immunology and genetics, and really prioritize that. We decided that the right thing to do was to create shareholder value, reset the capital structure for both companies, and free them both to have long-term, sustainable, appealing growth and returns.
So when you are in the pharmaceutical industry, like many other large industries, they are not run as much by women as maybe they should be. So do you get asked every day, what's it feel like to be a woman running a major pharmaceutical company? I'm not sure there's any other women running major pharmaceutical companies right now. And how tired do you get of that question?
Well, I think probably like many of the women leaders that you meet, I try not to define my work by my gender, but I recognize the responsibility I have, just visibly and for others, to show what's possible. I've spent pretty much all of my career being a minority in the room, mainly for my gender. I do believe that the question of diversity and inclusion that, let's face it, we have all rightly woken up to in a very humbling and shocking way, particularly on the question of race and ethnicity this year, is something that all responsible companies need to take really seriously, because the data just shows that more diverse leadership delivers better results.
If a young woman is watching now and she's saying, I want to be Emma Walmsley, I want to be the CEO of a major company, and I want to overcome all the prejudices and so forth, what would you say to her? What are the leadership traits that you think enabled you to get to the top?
First of all, don't aspire to be Emma Walmsley. Aspire to be the most exciting version of yourself, and never think of it as some end state. It's a constantly evolving learning journey. You want, in my experience, but my experience won't be the same as whatever the best experience is for you, is what drove me was doing work that I thought mattered, that I loved, working admittedly incredibly hard, because I think I had a strong influence of that growing up, that sense of responsibility and duty. Probably a good dose of fear of failure kept me going along the way, and wanting to have some kind of impact, and then taking on loads of jobs that along the way that weren't perhaps obvious at the time, but make a lot of sense looking back, whether they might have been moving from New York to Shanghai at a time people thought that was very odd, or taking a pay cut to go and work on hair color. But as long as you're doing things that you can be curious about and learn and keep and you love, then the success can follow.
Never met, obviously, Walt Disney, but if you had a chance to talk to him, what would you want to ask?
Obviously, probably the number one question would be, how am I doing?
There's a lot of concern in Hong Kong, and you can see the way actions, reactions, and further anxieties arise. I hope we can settle down to a new normal.
This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
Well, I watch your interviews, so I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell.
And how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? If there is one form of music that America is famous for having invented, it's jazz. Invented in the early part of the 20th century in New Orleans, jazz has now become synonymous with American music, not just in the United States, but around the world. And America has produced incredible jazz legends like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong. But today, at the top of the jazz world is Wynton Marsalis, the founder and director of Jazz at Lincoln Center. He's a performer, he's an educator, he's a composer, and he lives jazz 24 hours a day. So do you get tired of people calling you a jazz legend? Do you feel older when they say that to you?
Yeah, I like the word jazz. I don't like the legend.
Let's talk about your family for a moment. Sadly, your father passed away in April at the age of 85 because of COVID. So it must have been a very sad loss because you were very close to him, of course.
Yeah, for all of us, for me and my brothers, of course, as he's our father. We loved him so much. He was such an example for us, and he's such a kind man and a man with a large worldview and also a large person. He didn't do small things. He was very philosophical. He wasn't a touchy-feely type of person. He's from that generation too. It wasn't a lot of hugging and I love yous going on, but there was underneath a lot of resolve and seriousness and just kind of deep love, not just for us, but also he had many students who love him and love to tell stories about him, and he supported a lot of us.
So for those who may not be familiar, your father was a very, very prominent jazz pianist. When you were growing up, did you obviously look up to your father? Was he somebody who said, I want you to be a trumpet player, I want you to be a jazz trumpet player, or did he not push you into that?
No, he didn't push any of us into anything. You know, I always hung out with him. My father really struggled when I was growing up. He was trying to play modern jazz in an era of segregation and in clubs and with a populace that didn't like that style of music. So much of my experience was going to sparsely populated clubs with him in colorful areas. So I loved to go because I was always the only kid in the room. And it started when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, and it continued till I got into high school and started to work myself. But I always went with him and identified with his struggle, really, because he continued to play even though he didn't get audience support. He was not well known. He wasn't famous. He struggled financially. He never complained, and he was very high-minded in his belief in jazz and in his belief in the necessity of it as a tool for healing people and raising consciousness and things like that.
So when you were growing up, you obviously experienced racial discrimination because it was a segregated area then, is that right?
Yeah, that defined the entire segregation, discrimination, racism. That was just a part of life. Like it's not something you could, this is not philosophy I'm talking now. It's just how it was. Your neighborhood looked a certain way, the white neighborhoods were a certain way. Black people generally lived in our area on one side of the railroad tracks. We still had ditches in our streets. And any type of systems always worked against you. And you had to, it was what the system was. You didn't have distance from it. So you didn't have, it's easy to look back on a thing and experience it, not the way you experienced it when you grew in it. When you grew in it, it was very much a fact of life. So I happen to be someone who never liked it. So I fought with it a lot and had a lot of problems in that system, but most people adapted to it and were okay with it. They didn't like it, but they would sometimes you're in a bad situation. In this case, we're talking about racism. It could be anything. It could be a health situation. Right. The degree to which you're willing to fight against it really is based on your ability to accept the pain of fighting against it.
So are you surprised about the Black Lives Matter situation? Here we are in the year 2020, well advanced past the time that you grew up, and we still have racial problems of that type.
Yeah, we're not anywhere near advanced past what I grew up with. So no, I'm not surprised by it. I had the honor to go into so many American schools throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. It probably well over 1,000 schools. So we have a segregation in our systems in general. So no, it doesn't, none of it is surprising to me.
So today, as a famous jazz musician, you're recognized all over the country and many places around the world. Do you feel you are still suffering from racial discrimination? Do you still feel, even despite your exalted status in the music world, you are really not treated the same as you would be if you were white?
Yes, I feel that. I feel it in terms of the kind of intellectual patronization that I receive, the low level of criticism of our music. I'm subject to things, of course, nothing like what I grew up with, nor do I make a habit of complaining about it constantly, because I'm also treated in a way, with so much respect by so many people that for me to complain would be past gratuitous. So if you ask me the question directly, yes, I will say I've been treated unfairly by newspapers. Something like the New York Times, the way our institution, Jazz at Lincoln Center, has been covered is abominable. Even though we get articles, the quality of those articles are always very poorly researched. The writers, oftentimes down through the history, lack the intelligence and depth of engagement with the form to be qualified to speak on it in a paper of record. But because it's jazz, it doesn't matter. So that's only in direct response to your question, because I don't want to I don't want to confuse it with when I was growing up or the situations that I found myself in, or my father's situation or grandfather's, or let's go back in the generations. So I'm not doing that. And I'm very, very grateful for how I've been treated by people all over this country of all kinds.
So there's a story that when you were 10, your father had you sit down with, I think, Al Hurt, and maybe it was Miles Davis, and they said, how would you like to play the trumpet? And they gave you a trumpet to play. Is there anything true to that?
No, when I was 6, my father was playing with Al Hurt, and Al Hurt gave me a trumpet for my 6th birthday. So that's true. And my father later was talking to Miles Davis and said, I'm getting my son a trumpet. Before Al got me a trumpet, my father was talking to Miles. He was standing with Al, and Miles said, don't get that boy a trumpet, it's too hard. So that is a true story.
Okay, so as you grew up, you were actually, as I understand it, a classical musician more than a jazz musician. And when you went to Juilliard, where you went to college, you were interested in classical music. Is that true?
No, I grew up always wanting to play jazz, but jazz is always much more difficult to learn in that time, especially than classical music. Because my father was a jazz musician, I was always around the music. I was raised in the culture. I love the musicians. And my father was a modern jazz musician. He wasn't playing New Orleans jazz, but at a certain time when I was maybe 10 or 11, he started to play New Orleans music, and I also played in Danny Barker's Fairview Baptist Church Band, which was a New Orleans traditional band. Jazz, it was difficult at that time for a person my age and my generation to figure out what it was, because it was not a part of the American mythology. Whereas with classical music, you had competitions and classes you could go to, so you could get a track record on your resume. Like if you see what did I do, it will say when I was 14, I won a competition to play the Haydn Trumpet Concerto with the New Orleans Philharmonic. But I was playing jazz the whole time. But what could I say that I did? I played in a club called Tyler's Beer Gardens on a Wednesday.
But one year you won a Grammy, the only person ever to win a Grammy in jazz and in classical music in the same year.
There's a funny story about my father. He went to the Grammys. He was not into those kind of things. And he sat through the whole show and he was like, wow, this is the Grammys. So at the end of the show, I won. I was back in the hotel with him and my mother. I was like, getting ready to go out to the party or something. And I was like, yeah, man, my daddy looked at me and he was wondering. He said, man, I'm glad that was the Grammys, huh? He said, yeah, well, I'm glad you won. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's great that you won. But you don't think this means you can play, do you? So I started laughing because I was like 22. And I knew what he was saying because I still, of course, had a long way to go to learn how to play.
What did people say initially when you said we need to do more jazz at Lincoln Center?
Maybe the initial founders, Rockefeller, they didn't like the music. It doesn't matter. The Constitution was not written with the rights of Afro-Americans and Native Americans in mind. But the Constitution can be amended, and it has been amended.
You could argue classical music came from Europe, and you can argue that other parts of music came from other parts of the world, but jazz was invented in the United States, and it's a classic American kind of invention, I would say. But why is it so hard for some people to understand it? You've written a book about it, and you make it in your book sound like it's almost a religious experience to play jazz and to understand jazz. It's important to be an individual who can play well, but also to play with a team. Can you explain why jazz is almost like a religion to people who care about jazz?
Well, jazz is our national art form. And as such, it objectifies a lot of our basic principles. And if a group of people are blessed to have an art form, which you can have a civilization and a society, you may never create an art form that does that. It's a blessing. So America was blessed with a group of musicians and a social condition that produced this music. The music has three fundamental elements. The first is improvisation, which is our kind of individuality and what we believe in. We have rights and freedoms and things that are about the individual. Then swing, which is about nurturing common ground, finding balance with other people, working out an agenda as you go along under the pressure of time. And then the blues, and the blues is an optimism that's not naive. So the blues also implies an acuity. That's a democratic thing. Now, suffice to say that everything in the music ties into things that we do down to the three branches of government, like the rhythm section, or to amend the Constitution is like adding to an arrangement. I could go on. And after a while of giving you these examples, you'll realize these are not superficial things that are contrived, that they actually come out of the American way of life. Now, to kind of give you, it's going to be a little longer answer, but it's important because the central question of jazz's position in our country concerns the relationship of slavery to the American identity and our mythology as a country. Black Americans, by and large in our country, have little or no knowledge of jazz. And jazz is the greatest achievement of the Afro-American culture in the context of the American culture, meaning it's Afro-American, but it applies to all Americans, as many things in American culture apply to all Americans. Our poor public education system makes sure that a certain group remains ignorant. And the average white jazz writer is actually a rock fan who's for a long time wished that jazz would actually be something else without Black folks at the core of it, or that maybe jazz would just die away. That's why if you study jazz, there's a long-standing tradition of article after article and decade after decade saying, is jazz dead? That's probably one of the most questions that's been asked since the 1930s. Now, all of this investment and the destruction of jazz is to further obscure a big lie that jazz uncovers. And it's important to look at this because it's a serious thing to consider if we're to transform our nation. If we say our nation is based on human freedom, and we're the first on earth founded on the glorious celebration of human freedom, dignity, and rights, how do we then reconcile and correct the systemic, dehumanizing ownership and brutalizing of a large underclass of people for free labor because of their skin color? It's too much injustice to correct. So we're forced to say that those people are responsible for the problem. They're less than human, and it's just their condition. But if they aren't, if it's not their condition, it means that our mythology and belief about ourselves is not true. Now, is Elvis gonna not be the king? Man, where you gonna put jazz if Elvis is the king?
So let me ask you, if I were to go to listen to a Tchaikovsky concert or a Beethoven concert, it's going to be mostly sounding the same no matter where I'm going to listen to it, no matter what orchestra. They basically might play slightly better, slightly different, but basically you know what you're going to get when you sit down. With jazz, am I wrong in that a jazz musician can kind of expand on what has been composed and kind of play it differently every different time? Is that part of what jazz is all about?
That's the improvisation part. That one part allows you have a lot of latitude to do things. That's like the way Americans conduct business, all the innovations we have, the freedom we have to speak, the fact that we think we can step into a space and use our personality to transform a tradition. Yes, we have that freedom. But balancing that freedom is we have the responsibility to extend a courtesy and an understanding to other people who have those freedoms and nurture that common space. That's the part of jazz we struggle with.
So in your book on jazz, you talk about some of the greats who either played with or who influenced you. And I'd just like to ask your brief comments on some of them. First is Louis Armstrong. You originally thought he was, as you say, an Uncle Tom, but you obviously changed your view, I guess.
Yeah, because it's hard for later generations to understand the challenges of an earlier generation and norms and things of show business and what Louis Armstrong did. It doesn't mean that necessarily, even with I understand more of his genius and who he was and what he played, but it still doesn't mean that when I look at the movies he made or the positions he went, I still don't necessarily like that. I don't like a lot of where black people are in any of the American movies of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And as a matter of fact, some of it now, a lot of it now, that has that same type of destructive mythology. If you consider the fact that when I was a teenager, the heroic figure for black youth in movies were pimps. I mean, what is it for a pimp to be a hero, be at the top of your mythology? So, but to not get sidetracked with that, yeah, I thought that. But later I learned and understood who Louis Armstrong was as a musician. That's a totally different story. That man was a genius of such magnitude, you could lie about how great he was and you still wouldn't be saying enough.
So you're a composer as well as a performer, educator, conductor, and so forth. One of the great composers in the jazz world was Duke Ellington. Did he have any influence on you?
Great. I love Duke. And Duke's intelligence, his dedication, over 2,000 pieces. And I love him. And because I grew up also listening to classical music, I love Beethoven.
What about Dizzy Gillespie? Was he an influence on you?
The thing about Dizzy Gillespie that hit me first was the depth of his intelligence. I met him when I was 14. And just when he started talking, the way my daddy and other musicians listened to him, yeah, Dizzy was very intelligent. He's part of the reason that we developed jazz at Lincoln Center, because I didn't want to play in a big band because I had always grown up playing small band music. And Dizzy told me, I called him and asked him, man, what do you think I should do? He said, to lose one's orchestral heritage should not be considered an achievement. So he was telling me, because you need to figure out how to keep our orchestral heritage. Now, we paid a lot of dues to build up orchestral music in jazz, and for us to just give it away and say the big band is old-fashioned, that's not intelligent.
Let's talk a bit about jazz at Lincoln Center. So you began playing jazz at Lincoln Center when, in the late 1980s?
Yeah, 1987.
That evolved into Jazz at Lincoln Center, which is, you're now the artistic director and music director of the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. Is that right?
We wanted to fill a space in the American arts and provide enough education and music and advocacy, enough concerts for us as a nation to have our native art form when it came time for us to address our mythology and correct it so that we could move forward as a nation. So we've succeeded beyond any of our wildest imagination with the volume of concerts we've been able to do. We built 3 concert halls in the middle of Manhattan on 59th Street, the House of Swing. We have put on concert series over 30 years. We have 12 education programs. And even since this pandemic, I mean, we've put out over 500, 600 pieces virtually. We're deeply engaged.
So when you started Lincoln Center, when Lincoln Center opened in the 1960s, people thought, okay, this is opera, symphonic music, classical kind of music. You came along and said, maybe we could have jazz. What did people say initially when you said we need to do more jazz at Lincoln Center?
We had a lot of support from the top of the organization. Everybody was dedicated. And when it was founded, maybe Lincoln Center didn't think about the music, or maybe the initial founders, Rockefeller, they didn't like the music. It doesn't matter. The Constitution was not written with the rights of Afro-Americans and Native Americans in mind, but the Constitution can be amended, and it has been amended.
How do you divide your time between playing, conducting, composing, and teaching?
I work all the time, so I don't separate anything. My work is also my hobby.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear
that wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
Let me ask you, on a normal time before COVID came, and hopefully when COVID's gone, you'll return to the situation you had before. Are you on the road half the time and half the time in New York, or how do you divide your time? And how do you divide your time between playing, conducting, composing, and teaching?
Well, I do many things. I'm also the managing director of our organization. So I deal with everything in our staff. Our executive director, Greg Scholl, and our management team. They're all fantastic colleagues. If anything, I mean, I work all the time. So I don't separate anything. My work is also my hobby. And this pandemic I always respected all of my colleagues, but I'm going to tell you that the pandemic has given me such a greater appreciation of the quality of people I've been blessed to work with. Our orchestra, we still have a vast majority of our staff on. We're open for business. We're getting things done. The orchestra is so supportive of the mission of the organization. We have 11 arrangers in our orchestra. That's something that has never happened. Composers, teachers, the phone calls I get. Then when you get to our staff and our managers of every division of our building, our financial, our CFO, I can go position to position. People's dedication will bring me to tears. And that's why, you know, we're struggling like all the arts organizations are, because we've lost the ability to earn revenue. But we are so for real about our mission and achieving it, even under this type of duress. I think it's really the greatest blessing I've had in my life has been to work with this high quality people for this amount of time. So I'm so grateful for that opportunity. I don't even consider it to be work.
When you go overseas, is jazz popular outside the United States?
Jazz has never really been popular. So no, it's not popular like funk was popular, like rock and roll is popular. It's not popular. Jazz is meaningful and is necessary. So those who are interested in that like jazz. Those who are not, they don't like jazz. There's a lot of other things to like. We need to teach our kids about the music. It is a national art form. And I always make the point, people say, what's going to be new in jazz? I say, people are going to listen to it. That's what's the new thing.
Let's suppose somebody says, I've never been exposed to jazz very much. I've just listened to Wynton Marsalis. I'm persuaded he knows what he's talking about. So I'm going to listen to jazz. What is it that you would tell people about why the jazz experience as a listener is so compelling compared to other forms of music?
Well, because it has a development section. So you have to follow what musicians play from one point. It's like what I loved about that Beethoven symphony. It wasn't just one thing repeated over and over and again. It was a thing, and then another thing, another thing. Jazz is the music that's most in the world like conversation. Jazz is a music that prizes individuality. You have a lot of great individuals you can interface with, from Lester Young to Billie Holiday to Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock. You can name musicians. You have great groups that you can love. They play in different forms. And you have the whole Afro-Latin form of jazz that takes you everywhere from Brazil to Cuba to Puerto Rico. It integrates your citizenship and your understanding of the world. And most importantly, it gives you tremendous pride in being American, because we didn't have to denigrate or cut anybody down or do anything negative to anybody to create this. It's a non-predatory form. It's a symbiotic form. And you can be as rich as you want to be in jazz, and nobody else has to be poor.
You're a teenager by my standards, so you're very, very young, but I expect you'll continue to do this for another couple decades because this is what you love doing. Is that right?
Man, I still smell Similac on you. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this till I die if I can. If the good Lord willing, and people will have me. I've been blessed to do something kind of this abstract and get unbelievable support from people. That's why earlier when I answered the question of racism, for somebody like me to complain I'd have to be out of my mind.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
While I watch your interviews, I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell, and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? For the last several decades, one of the most important people in international finance is actually not that well known to the public. Her name is Kristalina Georgieva. She was a senior commissioner of the European Commission. She was the chief executive of the World Bank, and now she is the managing director of the IMF. And in that position, she heads an organization whose purpose is to help countries that have financial problems. Today, because of the pandemic, there are many countries that have financial problems, and there are many people that are calling Kristalina. You've been a senior commissioner of the European Commission, and now you're the managing director of the IMF. In getting these positions, was it more difficult because you were a woman or you were from a small country called Bulgaria? Where was there more prejudice, against being a woman or from Bulgaria?
Well, ultimately, I got these jobs. So whatever the prejudice was didn't hold me back. If I am to make a call on that, I would say being from a small country always requires to work twice as hard as others to prove yourself.
When you're growing up in a small country and then behind the Soviet curtain, Iron Curtain, did you ever think that you would wind up in these kind of positions as a young girl? Did you imagine anything like this?
David, even today, there are moments when I'm pinching myself. Am I the head of the IMF, coming from where I'm coming from? So no.
So many people don't know, honestly, what the IMF and the World Bank do. So can you explain what they actually do and why they're different and why we need them?
So in the end of the Second World War, in a beautiful place in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, enlightened leaders came together and said, we have to help the world to not get into war. And to do so, we need to help the economy to perform better. And they created these two sister institutions, the IMF, with a mandate on financial stability, growth, and employment, and the World Bank to invest in reconstruction of then war-torn countries.
Okay, so your job at the IMF is to take a country that, let's say, has financial problems. Their economy is weak or they have other kind of crises, and you can help them through that difficult time by lending them money. And right now you have about $270-some billion outstanding.
Yep.
But do you actually get paid it back?
So the loans we provide are with very attractive interest rates because it is the money of our members. They extend to each other a helping hand. For the poorest members, we charge no interest. These are soft loans, much softer than the traditional IMF loans. Countries pay us back. The poorer countries have longer maturity and longer time to serve their loans to us. But what matters is not just the money. What matters is that we work with countries to make them stronger so they can repay with more ease. And that is absolutely paramount for people to know about the fund. We are there to help countries to have strong economic fundamentals.
Okay. Now, there's some people who say that sometimes when the IMF has lent money in the past, let's say to Argentina or Greece, the terms are, let's say, draconian, and there's a lot of, I would say, revulsion in those countries against the harsh IMF terms. Is that still fair, or those things are the days of the past?
Well, of course, we learn from experience, and one of the things we learned is that we have to pay very close attention to the impact of programs on people. Policies are for people. Macro decisions have micro consequences. And we are integrating this much more in the programs we do today. We think about social spending, put a floor. Don't allow education and health to be so dramatically impacted that human capital of the country is eroded.
Or let's suppose I'm the president of a country and I, would like some extra money, and can I call you up and say, I'd like to borrow some money, and how hard is it to get the money? How long does it take? And are people afraid of calling you because their own credit ratings might go down if it's known that they have to borrow money from the IMF?
If you're a president of a country in trouble, you better call, because if you do not have access to markets, and some developing countries don't, then the only way to boost your economy is to rely on the IMF, the World Bank, institutions like us. Because this is an exogenous shock, it is truly an emergency. The way we respond is different from what we do when a country isn't in trouble because it mismanaged its economy. It is the fault of those that have been governing at that time. What we are asking countries is two questions. One, please, when you get the money, prioritize your health system and helping the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable part of the economy. 2, show me the receipts. What did you use the money for? We are advising countries to spend more, but keep the receipts. We want accountability, not just to us, but to the taxpayers in the countries. And we have advanced already financial lifelines to 75 countries in record short time. I mean, in this place, when a crisis knocks on the door, we turn on a dime. We are the world's first responder in crisis.
Now, recently, you have asked the G20 to more or less have a debt forgiveness situation so that some people that owe you money wouldn't have to pay it back. Why did you need to do that?
When we got hit by this crisis, 4 poor countries, that is devastating twice as much as it is for countries that are wealthier. Why? Because 1, they have weak health systems. 2, they have very little capacity to respond on their own. And 3, a number of them have had high debt levels by that time. So the economy is in standstill. If debt service is not put in standstills, these countries have to decide, do they pay doctors and nurses and save lives or serve their debt? And that is bad for them, but it is also bad for the rest of the world because a country in desperate situation falling to pieces turns into a security threat to its neighbors and the rest of the world.
So you have lots of economists here. What are the economists here telling you about the state of the economy in the world? Because of the pandemic, are we likely to have a kind of global recession for another year or so?
We have some optimism on 2 grounds. The first one is exceptionally decisive action by central banks and by finance authorities. They put a floor under the world economy. We, on our side, have done our part for the countries that have no resources on their own. The second reason we are somewhat more optimistic today than we were a couple of months ago is that we see the world learning how to function with the pandemic still with us. But make no mistake, the recovery is partial and it is uneven. We are not going to see in 2021 return to pre-COVID conditions, and we are seeing big divergence, parts of the economy doing really well and parts falling behind. And this is my biggest concern, that we may come on the other side of this crisis with more inequality, higher debt, higher deficits, and a climate crisis still hanging on us. If we are strong as a world, we ought to come together. A massive coordinated stimulus can make it so that we have a better economy on the other side than we had in 2019.
How did you wind up in the Fiji Islands?
I got the letter, the invitation to go and teach. I had to virtually go to the map and see where Fiji was.
a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
I'm certain that we will be able to bring our debt levels down and avoid what you could call a debt crisis because we are focused and we've been open enough by telling the nation that we have too much debt.
So let's talk about your background. As I mentioned at the outset, you grew up in Bulgaria.
Mm-hmm.
Bulgaria at that time was behind the Iron Curtain. So it was not a powerful country in the West, and it was actually a small and I think relatively poor country. It turns out you were from a prominent family, but not a wealthy family. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
So yes, I was a daughter of ordinary people. My father was a road engineer. My mother stayed at home to look after us. Modest means. Very happy childhood, very loving parents. Yes, my family was prominent, but I didn't know that until I was in my 20s. Why? Because my father was concerned that if we talk about the revolutionary who was my great-grandfather and the fact that we can trace back our origins 5 centuries into the past, that may not gel well with the power of the proletariat.
So when you're growing up in Bulgaria in, let's say, the 50s and 60s, were you required to learn Russian?
Of course, of course.
And English?
Yes. No, my mother was a Francophone, so she sent me to learn French. I had some French. When Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and Glasnost and Perestroika came to Bulgaria, I was able to apply for a scholarship in the West, and in 6 months I learned English enough to pass, to win a British Council scholarship to go to London School of Economics. That was incredible, to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And what I found out over there, having access to information, was that my country was broke. My country was so much deep in debt that I couldn't imagine how it is going to survive. Sure enough, 2 years later, Bulgaria, the economy collapsed and Bulgaria turned a page away from socialism to market economy.
How did you wind up in the Fiji Islands?
Now, that is a story. So when I was at London School of Economics, a professor noticed me as somebody who is quite professional. He then became the Dean of Economics in the University of South Pacific in Suva, in Fiji. He's sitting there wondering how he can find highly qualified professors that are willing to work for very little money. And so, brilliant idea. Wrote to this Bulgarian woman. I got the letter, the invitation to go and teach. I had to virtually go to the map and see where Fiji was. Getting from Bulgaria to Fiji in 1990 was an adventure. And so I'm landing in Fiji. I handed my passport to the passport control lady. She takes it, types something, looks at me and says, "Where are you from?" I said, "Bulgaria." She types again, looks at me and says, "There is no such country." The first Bulgarian to go to Fiji. Now, the professor really liked me. He offered me a job. I still remember he offered me a job, $16,000 a year. I had no idea of my market value. At that time, I was paid $100 a month, but I still didn't take the job. Why? Because it was so far from Bulgaria. So I went back. I got a chance to go to MIT, to come to the United States, and the rest is history.
But did you ever say, I'm not going back to Bulgaria, I'm now in the West, and I'm going to stay in the West?
Actually, no. I came to MIT with the idea to spend 1 year, learn as much as I can, and bring this knowledge back to Bulgaria. I actually had a contract to write a textbook on environmental economics as an outcome of this visit. But the World Bank called me up. They offered me a summer job. I came for the summer. The 4th day, I'm in this consulting job. I got the call and I got an offer to stay at the bank. Why? At that time, the bank was looking for environmental economists. 92, post-Rio, check. They were desperate for women. They were very male-dominated, so check. And they were opening up towards the Soviet Union, former Eastern Bloc, Russian speakers, check. So I took the job. I said, well, you know, this is such an opportunity to work here. And then I did incredibly interesting jobs within the bank. I raised up in the ranks.
Right.
And one day I got the call to go to Europe.
What did you actually do there? What was your job?
I had first the job of humanitarian and crisis commissioner, and it was an incredible experience. I had the front seat position in all the terrible crises that were happening at that time, from Haiti earthquake to the triple disaster in Japan to the Syrian war. And I was able to mobilize the very best of Europe to help people in terrible need and reform the crisis response system of Europe. One of my strong memories of this time, I'm in a village talking to a Syrian girl who wants to go back to school, but there is no schooling available. And I said to her, her name was Aisha, I said, Aisha, I hope you would be able to go back to school. I walked out of there and I thought, my hoping means nothing to her. My acting would make a difference. Right. And then we mobilized and we scaled up massively access to education for Syrian refugee children.
Have you ever thought of running for office in Bulgaria, or you're quite happy where you are?
I always take the job I have as what takes my full concentration. I pour my heart in it.
Generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
talked about Bretton Woods and how the IMF and the World Bank were created in the late 1940s. If you had been there then, how would you change the structure for the IMF or the World Bank? And might you think there could be some time in the future when some of the structure might be changed to make it better?
Well, they were created very thoughtfully with institutions that evolve with time. Their shareholding changes as the world economy changes. What is required from us is to relentlessly pursue this adjustment. So the IMF, in terms of its governance and the shareholding, reflects the world of today. Right. And that takes a lot of work bringing the membership together. The IMF has done a successful quarter adjustment. This is changing shareholding, and now is due to take stock again. So between now and 2023, that would be a very important job to do.
So what percentage of the people who are on the staff, are they Americans or from overseas, and what percentage are male or female and so forth?
So we have just about 75% of staff from all countries in the world, and around 25% are Americans. Logically, for many positions, we recruit locally, like for some of the assistants, coordinators. For the professional pool, we recruit internationally and competitively. Broadly speaking, we are about the same men and women, but you wouldn't be surprised. When we go up, there are more men than we have down. And this is something that I'm zeroing on. When I came, directors, this is the layer of management that has most important operational responsibility, were 25% women, 75% men. Now they are 40-60. Okay. And I would drive this pipeline of talented women, not because I am obsessed with percentages, but because diversity matters. Having different regional perspectives, having men and women working together makes us more effective. We make better decisions as a result.
Historically, the World Bank president was picked more or less by the United States administration, the president of the United States, and the head of the IMF was more or less picked by Europeans, I would say. You foresee that that will change, or that's going to continue for the foreseeable future?
I think that there would be more and more demand to make these positions open for competition based on merits. And even if you take this round, yes, I'm a European, Europe aligned to nominate me, but I'm a European from a country that in the mid-90s benefited from an IMF program. I do belong to emerging markets, and emerging markets were very loud in supporting me for that reason. So I want to see that process to continue. Why? Because institutions are much stronger when the whole world believes they belong to all of us.
Now, China has become a major economic power, I guess the second largest economy in the world. Does China have the influence in the IMF and the World Bank proportionate to its overall global economy now?
Well, they have increased their shareholding in both institutions. They have been also very active in supporting the institutions. In the case of the IMF, China, the US, the rest of the world, in this crisis, stepped up significantly support for us to be able to extend concessional lending. And I see the engagement of China as constructive. That is so very important when we are in the midst of the worst crisis we have had since the Second World War.
So the IMF stands for the International Monetary Fund. Mm-hmm. Have you ever thought of changing it to say it stands for I am fair, I am friendly? Wouldn't that be better?
I love that. Most people here in the fund say it stands for it is mostly fiscal. But I much prefer the definition you gave. And actually, this is what I would relentlessly work for. We at the fund to always think of the people whose lives are impacted by the policies we recommend.
You're the most prominent person in the West from Bulgaria, as far as I know. Maybe there's somebody else, but I can't think of anybody else. So I assume you could go back to Bulgaria whenever you wanted to and run for president of Bulgaria. Yeah, I don't know if that's a better job than the one you currently have, but have you ever thought of running for office in Bulgaria, or you're quite happy where you are?
I always take the job I have as what takes my full concentration. I pour my heart in it. I never, ever think of what next. So as long as I'm the head of the IMF, it is the IMF and the membership that has my complete dedication. We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
Well, I watch your interviews, so I know how to do some interviewing.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said fine. I didn't negotiate with him, and I did no due diligence.
I have something I'd like to sell, and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because being only the second wealthiest man in the world, is that right? In the United States today, there are only 38 women who are serving as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. One of those with the best track record is Tricia Griffith. She is the CEO of Progressive Insurance, one of the largest automobile insurance companies in the United States. She started out as a claim adjuster and worked her way up over many years to become, in 2016, the CEO. Since that time, the stock is up more than 175%. My big mistake was I didn't know her then, and I didn't buy the stock in the company. If she ever leaves that company and goes anywhere else, I'm going to buy that stock right away. So for those who aren't familiar with Progressive, and probably if you watch television, you would be familiar because you have a lot of television ads, right? And I'm just curious, why is it that automobile insurance companies seem to advertise a lot? I see your competitors advertising, you advertise a lot. Is that because people really will be guided in their insurance decision by the advertisement?
It's just a really competitive industry, which is always odd because it's something you're required to have. So it's not like, you know, do you pick a different soft drink or a beverage? But it is required. But it is so competitive that to be out there and be top of mind and be on the short list, you really have to be advertising.
So you have a famous character in your insurance, some of your ads called Flo, a woman that plays, I guess, an insurance person. Does she get a certain percentage of all the new business she brings in because she's so good, or she doesn't have that deal?
No, she does not have that deal. She is paid per contract, and she's doing fine.
Let's talk about this year. Now, a lot of the auto insurers are up this year, in part because people aren't driving as much. And the theory is if you don't drive as much, it's hard to have an accident. So I presume there are fewer people claiming that they've had an accident, and therefore you don't have to pay out as much. Is that why your stock is up, you think?
I think that might be one piece, but I think we've also continued to grow not only market share, based on units, based on policies in force. And really, if you think about it, yes, immediately in March, vehicle miles traveled have been reduced and losses went for that. But as states have reopened, it continues to go up. And right now, we're still not pre-COVID level of driving. We're about 8 to 10% down, but those loss costs, that gap is closing in because we're seeing more and more people driving more often. And so that lasted a couple of months. And then remember, many companies gave back credits or have reduced rates.
Now, let me ask you about that. If you get a rebate, that was because you voluntarily thought it was a good idea, or the regulators said you have to give back money. Why did the automobile insurers start giving back money to their policyholders?
We did it because it was the right thing to do. I mean, we immediately saw driving vehicle miles traveled go down 40%. It went back up pretty quickly to 20, et cetera. But we sat down and said, okay, we don't want margins that big. It's not the right thing to do. We want to be competitively priced. And so we gave 20% credits for both April and May. And then subsequently, we're very analytically driven. So we went sort of state by state, channel by channel, product by product. And so far, we've had rate decreases in about 35 states. And those are baked in permanently.
So today, when people have an accident today, when they do have accidents, the accidents are more expensive than they used to be. Is that because the cars are more complicated, more expensive to repair?
Yeah, they absolutely are. A couple of reasons. One is the components to the car. So I started out as a claims rep, and the cars in 1988, the bumper repair or replacement would be a couple $100. And now they could be upwards of $1,000, $2,000 because of the components, the safety components. In addition, think of the inflation of medical costs. So if you're injured in an accident, that's another component of the increased severity.
So let's suppose I want to get some automobile insurance. I'm now 71 years old. Am I a good risk as a 71-year-old, or would you rather have somebody who's 25 and more alert?
That is one variable. So we look at hundreds of variables. So it depends on where you live. Do you live in a congested area? Do you live in the rural area? What is your driving history? Do you have our usage-based insurance? That way we know what time of day you drive, how many miles you drive. Have you had any violations? There's so many things that go into it. So age is only one component.
When I was a teenager, I was told that teenagers are not good drivers and insurance is expensive. Is that true today? Insurance is more expensive for teenagers, are not good drivers?
I will say that having 6 people that drive in my family that we've added over the years, we call them youthful drivers. The issue is that many are good, but they just don't have that maturity. They haven't had the experience. And I remember saying, because a lot of times you'll get rate increases if you add on a youthful driver. And I challenged that when I first got this job. And then I realized, having 6 youthful drivers, that there is a reason you pay a little bit more.
You are in home insurance now. and you bought a company that helps you get into that. Why do you want to be in the home insurance business?
You know, for us, it was really access to more of the preferred customer, especially on the independent agent side. We had a relationship with ASI, American Strategic Insurance, for years. We had a small ownership in them, and their values were very much aligned with us. And so we decided to go ahead and purchase them. And it's been a really nice transition, a really great acquisition. And so now, you know, having sort of the whole picture for whatever you want, auto, home, your boats, motorcycle, commercial. And that's why we're continuing to expand, because I think it's really important to diversify.
Is the home insurance business very profitable now?
The home insurance business, it depends on what company you're talking about. We have struggled a little bit because of wind, hail, catastrophes, and we also have been obviously growing our model across the country. We were in about 5 states for many years, and so we're learning a lot about the product model. So if you looked at our results, we will be profitable, but we're doing the same thing we did on the auto side. We're getting very surgical in our segmentation to understand the right rate for each home.
Are you thinking of getting into the life insurance business? If you're in the other insurance businesses, why not get into life insurance?
Well, right now we have a great relationship with an unaffiliated partner that we get a commission when we send them to the company, and that's been working really well. And we actually are considering that. We have a life insurance company filed in Ohio. More to come on that.
People say that there's eventually going to be driverless or autonomous cars. And of course, the theory is they will never have an accident because they're perfectly programmed. Is that something you worry about, as cars that don't have accidents, or you're not going to worry about that right now?
I don't worry about it. I mean, from a society perspective, you want to have less accidents. It's good for society. Everyone has been affected by someone who's been in an auto accident. What I think about, I don't put my head in the sand, but what I think about is timing, realistic timing. That's also one of the reasons why I think about not just executing on our current plan, but expanding and exploring other possibilities, adjacencies to grow our business. I will tell you, though, when you look back at some of the headlines in 2012 that say this type of car is going to be fully autonomous by 2020 or 2015, it'll take longer. And I know that. That said, again, we're preparing for a possible smaller auto insurance industry. But again, we have so many opportunities with other adjacent models, including home and some of the other things we've talked about, whether it's TNC or commercial or small business, all the things that we've expanded to in the last couple of years.
Now, Elon Musk has said he's going to have an autonomous car out there at some point in the not too distant future. And he's also said, anybody that's an insurance agent, why don't you call me up, because we want to hire insurance agents. We're going to be in the automobile insurance business. Is that something you're worried about a lot?
Not really.
Because? I
think people love our culture, and I think they love working here, and I think that we have a huge future. I think that the technology is absolutely there, and I can see a car going from point A to B in a geo-fenced area, but there's a lot to be done. I think it'll be a little bit longer than most people had predicted even years ago.
When you were able to go into your office, you were well known for walking into the cafeteria and sitting down with the average person. Why did you do that? Why didn't you just eat in your office with other executives?
When you break bread with people, they open up to you, not just about great things, but about things they want to change.
about Progressive's background. Progressive, it's a great name, Progressive, that's a very positive word. Was that the original name of the company, and when was the company started?
Yes, it was the original name. The company was founded in 1937 by Joe Lewis and Jack Green, and they were two attorneys in Cleveland, and they didn't know what they wanted to do, but they wanted to be able to serve the non-standard customers in Cleveland that needed insurance. And so they borrowed $10,000 from Joe Lewis's mother-in-law, and that's how Progressive was born. And you might know Peter Lewis, who ran the company for a long, long time. He was the second CEO, and then Glenn Renwick, and then myself.
How did you get started at Progressive and at the bottom, pretty much? Is that right?
Yeah, I went to Illinois State University, a marketing degree. I wanted to go into something in marketing, but all through high school and college, I worked in retail. So, and oddly, where I went to school is the home office of State Farm, and everybody was doing internships there. And I'm like, who wants to work in insurance? So I went to a retail company for about 6 months. It was called Furrow Building Materials. It was like think of like a Lowe's or a Home Depot. I was like, what am I doing? I'm mixing paint. I'm actually forklift certified. And I was driving home one day with my hard hat, and I said, I gotta look for something different. And what I wanted to do was work somewhere for a couple of years, pay off my school loans, and then go to get my MBA. So I went home and opened the classified ads. I'd never heard of Progressive. At that time, we were less than $1 billion. And I thought, claims rep trainee, this sounds interesting, $19,000, that'll help me pay off my debt, and made the call.
So the job is to be a claim adjuster.
Correct. So what I would do if I had your claim and you were injured, I would go out and talk to you about your injury and guide you through that. I would crawl under your car and let you know how much it took to get it repaired. I would kind of manage your whole file. I also did special lines, so I was a motorcycle rep, and I basically handled the entire file. So I was in body shops, crawling under cars, and in your house talking to you about your injury.
You've obviously risen up from the lowest position to the highest position, and you had many different positions in between. One of them, which is very unusual to have for a CEO, maybe sadly, is to be the head of human resources. So how did you go from being the head of human resources to being the CEO?
Well, to me, to actually get the CHRO job from having mostly claims experience, during the first 15 years, I had a little bit of sales and a little bit of claims. And Glenn Renwick at the time, my predecessor, interviewed me. It was actually an odd circumstance that I went for it. I wasn't going to, because I don't have any HR experience. I have some maternity leaves, but that's about it. And people kept calling me from around the company saying, you have to go for this. You love diversity, you love metrics, we need this. So finally, I had a pre-interview lunch with Glenn to see if I could even go for it. He put my name in the hat and gave me the opportunity. And I will always say it was a risk for him. He does not say that, but that was really the turning point in my career. And then, he watched me, and I did that for 6 years and made a lot of big changes that we still have now. And the president of claims came open. That's my dream job because I love claims. I love helping customers. I was able to do that. That's 75 cents of every dollar of premium that comes in, you're paying out in claims. So that's a big business piece. And then he gave me all things customer facing. So I had our call centers and claims. And then I was COO before the CEO role. So I really credit Glenn for guiding me, giving me opportunities, coaching me, and sponsoring me.
So as head of human resources, you must have instituted some policies that changed the company's face, because your company's been voted the #1 most diverse company in the United States in some surveys. Is that something that you implemented and put into practice?
Yes, we started our diversity and inclusion initiatives really in earnest when I was there. We started our first employee resource groups, which was Progressive African American Network, and our LGBT+. Now we have 9. We really set forth a strategy of how we're going to make sure everyone can bring their whole self to work. It was a big piece of our culture, and we started looking at the data. We continue to work on it, though. It's not something that you can ever get a check mark. And if you look at senior leadership, we have opportunities there. And in fact, we are working on some really aggressive objectives for the next 5 years with my team to continue to change that.
Your chairman of your board is a woman, and obviously you're a woman. Is there any other Fortune 500 company where the chairman is a woman and the CEO is a woman? There must be none.
I don't think so. And we actually have 12 members of our board, and 6 are women, and 1 of the female is a person of color.
So when you were the COO, and I guess in line to be the CEO, did you think that they were going to give the job to a woman, or you thought this will revert to the normal form and we'll find a nice white male that we can give it to?
I was hoping to give it to the person they thought was the best fit for Progressive at the best time. And I remember interviewing with the board for several years during the process. And one of the board members said to me, "So you want to be a CEO?" And I said, "No, I want to be the CEO of Progressive." And that was what really was meaningful to me. So had I not gotten the role, I'd still be here. And there were lots of other opportunities to have a great CEO other than myself.
So when you were able to go into your office, you were well known for walking into the cafeteria and sitting down with the average person. Why did you do that? Why didn't you just eat in your office with other executives?
Because that is my way of getting to know people and really feeling what's going on with the company. And when you break bread with people, they open up to you, not just about great things, but about things they want to change. And for me, I think because of my roots as a claims rep trainee, I always wondered what the execs did. And we don't have an executive cafeteria. All of us eat in the regular cafeteria. It's a very different type of company from that perspective. But literally, it motivated me to be a better leader. Every time I walked up to a table of 5 people and said, "May I join you?" and they gave that horrible look like, "Please no, please no." And I sat down, I had 5 new friends. And to me, it's an important part to be approachable. If you feel connected and you trust your leader, you're going to run through the wall for them.
So when you sit down with people at the employee cafeteria, do they ever say, "By the way, I'm underpaid"? Or is that they never say that?
They'll sometimes talk about how they wish they could make more. What can they do? How can they get there? People are pretty open and honest with me.
What would you say are the leadership qualities that you brought to the table or that you most admire?
I don't always have to be the smartest person in the room. I know collectively what a team needs, and I love having really great debates.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Chinese capital market, as you know, is nascent, is just developing, and so we think there's an opportunity to build out that. But that's not all. We're also focused on continuing to build our presence in the Greater Bay Area. It's been a good business for us.
So as I talk to you, you're not in your office, I assume you're at your home?
That's correct. I'm in my little library off of our bedroom.
And have you been running Progressive from your little office there for a couple months now?
Yes, ever since mid-March. I go in sometimes once a week just to get my mail and to check things out, but I don't see anyone. And in fact, where I'm sitting here, my son, who's in film school, filmed me weekly for several months so I could send a video out to all of the Progressive people.
Has it been difficult to run the company remotely this way?
It hasn't been difficult for me. It's been unusual, and I don't love it because I love the interaction. I think the biggest part is the claims organization, because that is face-to-face, especially when you're looking at vehicles. But we immediately were able to use videos and pictures to do the best job we could to estimate vehicles, and we're doing pretty well, and I'm very proud of the organization.
When the world comes back, which hopefully it will be in some point in time when we have a vaccine, do you expect that all your employees will come back and work in the offices, or now do you think you could have people working remotely and maybe save money by not having as much office space? How do you think about this in the future?
Prior to COVID, we already had about 25% of our call center people and some claims people that worked from home just because it worked better for them. I imagine we're doing some surveying as we think about returning of what percentage will that still work for. I think in person, in the office, hallway conversations are so important. So although I think it might increase from that 25%, if you fast forward and there's a vaccine and people feel comfortable, I think a lot of people will come into the office. I think that is something that we work through. We've done a really great job, especially with technology, but I know many people really miss it.
You and your husband have 6 children, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
6 children.
Yes, his, hers, and ours.
All right, so when you have 6 children and you're running a company, isn't that kind of complicated? I mean, how do you have time in the day to do anything else?
It was very complicated as I was growing, going up through the ranks, and my husband worked as well. When I was in HR for a couple of years, we met at Progressive, so he worked there. We both had travel jobs, and at one point he said, when our oldest was going into high school, he said, one of us probably needs to stay home. I think you have a longer runway. And so he decided to stay home. But I think I treat it like everything else. Assume something might go wrong. And so when we were both traveling and I knew I had a big presentation, I knew that morning I would go into somebody's room and someone would have an ear infection. And so I created a network of friends that stayed home, and I did an old-fashioned bartering system. So if you could take Emma, for a couple of hours while I do this presentation, I will babysit your kids and you and your husband can go out on the weekend. I always had plan B, C, and D, just like you do in business.
What would you say are the leadership qualities that you brought to the table or that you most admire?
I mean, I think the ones I brought to the table were being genuine, being authentic, communicating, just all the time, painting the picture of where I want the company to go. And I think that's really important. I think people, you're only a leader if people want to follow you. So do people want to follow you? Do you have, a great attitude, but also a certain paranoia to make sure that we're always doing well? And for me, I think that what I'm most proud of, and I think why I continue to get jobs after that HR job, was I form really great teams. I don't always have to be the smartest person in the room. I know collectively what a team needs, and I love having really great debates. Right. And the only thing better than those debates are the unity, the power in the unity when you come out and you're solidified as a management team, as a leadership team.
So sometimes people say it's very difficult for women to have it all, to have a family and also have a great professional career. It's obviously possible. You've obviously done it. So what would you say is the trick to having it all and getting it all done, if you were to give advice to some younger woman?
I think there's things you don't give up. So Jack played high school and college football. It was important for me to go to as many games as I could of his, and I worked my way around that so I could do that. And sometimes that meant working, at 10 o'clock at night to catch up on things, but it was worth it because my kids tell me, even now, they're like, you went to more things than most stay-at-home moms, because I was so obsessed with making sure I got to almost everything.
So if you were to go to a football game or something like that with your kids, do people come up to you and say, you're the CEO of Progressive, or you try to avoid telling people you're the CEO of Progressive when you go to those kind of family events?
It's funny because my husband says all the time, why do you play 20 games with everyone? Because people will say, where do you work? And I'll say, for an insurance company. Oh, where? In Cleveland. What do you do? I'm corporate. Yeah, so I'll do all these things. So finally, I'm like, okay, I'm the CEO. What I have found, if you're on a plane, when you used to be on planes, or you're somewhere, a good way to not get in the conversation is they'll say, what do you do? And I say, I sell insurance, and then no one talks to you. So I've found the right thing. People. I live in a smaller town, and my kids went to a small Catholic school, so everybody knows me. When I got the job, the day that it was announced, I was headed to to our son's school after the workday to go to his lacrosse game. And our PR department kept saying, you know, the Wall Street Journal wants to talk to you. This place wants to talk to you. And I said, I'm headed to a lacrosse game. Let me call my mom. Let me call my sisters. Let me enjoy this. And I finally said, stop calling me, because I wanted to be present in the moment. And actually, I talked to my 5 other children, and Jack was on the field, and during halftime, I went up and I said, hi, and I went to tell him, and I said, hey, I need to tell you some news. He goes, I know, Mrs. CEO, it's you're trending on Twitter.
Suppose somebody came to you from Ohio and said, you run one of the best companies in Ohio, you should be governor of Ohio. Would you have any interest in running for office?
I think government would frustrate me. I like to get things done. I like to move forward, and I'm a big believer in compromise. So for me, I don't think government is in the future for me. I think I'd love to do some philanthropy, maybe a board or two. I'm on a public board now, and do some things with my husband to help the country.
And the higher calling of private equity, that doesn't appeal to you?
I'll let you do that.